I don't smoke.
הרעיון הבא יערך באנגלית, אז כל דוברי העברית מוזמנים לקחת אוזניות לתרגום הסימולטני. This interview will be held in English, so whoever speaks English doesn't need the headsets.
Okay.
ההיסטוריון היהודי הבריטי הפרופסור ברנרד לואיס מתמחה בתחום האסלאם ויחסי אסלאם ארצות הברית. פרופסור לואיס משמש כפרופסור אמריטוס באוניברסיטת פרינסטון, שם הוא מכהן כראש המחלקה ללימודי המזרח הקרוב. לואיס הוא אחד ההיסטוריונים הידועים בעולם, והוא נחשב לאחד מן הבכירים בחוקרי האסלאם המערביים. הפרופסור לואיס פרסם ספרים ומחקרים רבים בנושא האסלאם, המזרח התיכון ויחסי האסלאם והמערב. פרופסור לואיס נבחר לחבר האקדמיה האמריקאית לאומנויות ומדעים.
Chosen as a member of the Academy for Sciences and Philosophy in 1983, and we are honored to host him here for a live interview. Mr. Dan Dacre will interview him.
Good noon to everybody. Delighted to see such a great turnout. This is the second time that Professor Lewis has agreed at the Jerusalem Conference to offer us his insights that he began some 70 years ago, following this extraordinary region in all of its difficulties and its mysteries. And just before we came up on the stage, I was asked actually if I would take off my jacket so that there would be some symmetry between us. And I think there's so much work to do today that we really should roll up our sleeves and get to work. As you may know, Professor Bernard Lewis was born in London, England in 1916. He received his academic degrees at the University of London, and between 1941 and 1945, he was the head of one of the central desks of British intelligence in the Middle East. From 1974 to 1986, Professor Lewis was the Cleveland E. Dodge Professor of Near East Studies at Princeton. And since then, he has been sought out by governments, presidents, prime ministers, diplomats, and very much since 9/11, 2001, he's been sought out by millions of people around the world who are trying to understand the complexities and the mysteries of the Middle East, of Islam, and the Arab world. Professor Lewis, on behalf of everyone here, let me ask you, how do we understand Iran's behavior over the last year in the context of American and European outreach to Iran, in which it seems that the more the West has reached out to Iran, the more the regime in Iran has defied the West?
I think we have a classical answer to that question formulated more than 1,000 years ago by a great early medieval Arab writer called Ibn Hazm. He says, the essence of magnanimity is to spare your enemy when you have him completely at your mercy. To reach out to him before then and try and ingratiate yourself with your enemies, to treat your friends and your enemies alike, will arouse contempt for your enmity and distaste for your friendship, and you will not be long for this world.
So then, Professor Lewis, the word in Arabic, salam.
Oh, that's something else. Yes, go ahead.
I want to transition to in other words, you've offered us the beginning of the understanding of the concept of power in Islam. So let's follow that thought. How does Islam see power?
Well, addressing an Israeli audience, I think I have to begin by making a distinction. The Arabic word salam is obviously related to the Hebrew word shalom. And the Arabic greeting, salamu alaikum, is obviously an adaptation of the more ancient Jewish greeting, shalom aleichem. But there is an important difference. We are usually told that salam, like shalom, means peace. It does, but in a certain precisely defined rather restricted sense. It means peace within the true faith. Salam means the peace that one has by embracing Islam. It is not used for non-Muslims. It is used for Muslims even in a situation where there is no peace. Let me give you two examples. Some time ago I read extensively in the correspondence. Is this all right, by the way?
Yes.
In the correspondence between the Ottoman sultans and the various governments of Europe. Some of the letters were hostile, many of the letters were friendly when the Ottoman sultans found it expedient to establish alliances with this or that European government. And the letter always ends with greetings, as-salam, but not salamu alaykum. No, it doesn't say peace be with you. It says, as-salam ala man ittaba al-huda. Peace be upon those who follow the divine guidance. In other words, on Muslims, not on you. That's in a friendly letter. On the other hand, if we look at the correspondence between Ibn Saud and the Imam Yahya of Yemen, correspondence with worsening relations between the two, which finally led to the outbreak of war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, if I remember rightly, in 1925.
30s, yeah.
What?
It was in the 30s, yeah.
Well, the final letter, when negotiations have broken down, is a short telegram sent by Ibn Saud to the Imam Yahya, and it says, this is the end of our discussions. This means war. Wassalamu alaikum. Because he is addressing a brother Muslim. So that even in a state of war, salam means between Muslims. And I think one has to be very careful not to misunderstand the term salam as used traditionally and to the present day.
What does that mean, Professor Lewis? For the first time, I think, in modern political history, that a president of the United States said salam alaikum to the Arab world when addressing several thousand people in Cairo. How is that understood among Muslim listeners?
Well, I think more sophisticated Muslims will have understood what the situation was, but for many, using that greeting implies acceptance of Islam.
When you say acceptance of Islam, you mean as a superior culture, as a superior religion?
Becoming a Muslim. And in turn, the greeting Salamu Alaikum was not used either in addressing or being addressed by non-Muslims. It is an explicitly Muslim greeting.
You will reveal a secret that in another 3 months, the 31st or the 32nd book by Professor Bernard Lewis will be published. And the book is called Faith and Power.
Yes.
After so many extraordinary books trying to demystify the Middle East and help us in the West understand the fusion between politics, power, and religion, what does Faith and Power come to teach us?
Basic purpose is to explain that this whole business of church and state is something distinctively Christian and has no relevance at all in the Muslim world until fairly recently, when Christian examples and Christian practices are to some extent adopted, though usually in a rather superficial way. Excuse me. Christians are enjoined by Jesus to render unto God that which is God's and unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. And the difference between God and Caesar being the secular military power of the state, has continued all through the history of Christendom. And even in modern times, church and state are seen as separate, distinct entities, each with its own hierarchy, its own rules, and so on. They may be joined, they may be separate, they may be in harmony, they may be in conflict. One may dominate, the other may dominate. But all through Christian history and in the whole of Christendom, there is this dichotomy of church and state. This had not only no equivalent but no meaning in the Islamic world until comparatively modern times, when in this, as in so much else, they followed Christian practices. In the past, church and state were one and the same. The mosque is a building, a place of study and worship. There is no institution called the mosque. By the way, there's a similar dichotomy regarding Judaism. There's a story that many years ago, a Christian clergyman who made a special study of Jewish things wrote a book called The Systematic Theology of the Synagogue. And it was reviewed by a rabbi who began his review by saying, first, there is no such thing as the synagogue. And if there were, it wouldn't have a theology. And if it did, it wouldn't be systematic. And one may say much the same sort of thing about Islam. The mosque is, as I said, is a building, a place of study and worship. One cannot speak of the mosque as an institution in the way that one speaks of the church as an institution. And the difference is obvious. The foundation stories of the three religions, the three closely related, historically sequent religions, differs on this important point. Moses led his people out of bondage through the wilderness and was not himself permitted to enter the promised land. Jesus was crucified, and his followers were a persecuted minority for centuries before they were able to obtain control of the power of the state and use its power. Muhammad triumphed during his own lifetime. Not he, but his enemies were put to death. And he founded a religion which became a state and very soon an empire, almost during his own lifetime. So you have in Islam from the very beginning, in the sacred scriptures of the Quran, in the sacred narratives of the traditions of the Prophet, what the Prophet said or did on this or that occasion, a total identification and interpenetration of religion and government, of what we would call state and power, as state and church, which has no equivalent elsewhere. In modern times there has been some change. As I said, under European influence, we have seen the development of, how should I put it, ecclesiastical institutions, a hierarchy of muftis, for example, which has no parallel in classical Islam, but develops in modern Islam. And we see it very clearly in present-day Iran, in the land of the Islamic Revolution, where they have created already the Islamic equivalence of a papacy, an episcopate, and above all an inquisition.
Professor Lewis, you raise by implication a very serious question about the West's understanding or misunderstanding of Islam. What is the root of that misunderstanding, and why it seems Western policymakers and thinkers have not adjusted their understanding? And you wrote about this in The Return of Islam in 1976.
I think the root of this understanding is the common human failing. We all tend to judge others by ourselves. We tend to assume that their processes are the same as ours, their motivations are the same as ours. Sometimes it's right, often it's disastrously wrong. And now it's getting worse, because as I said, in the past there was no such thing as church and state, and such pairs of words as spiritual and temporal, secular and ecclesiastical, religious and profane, and so on. These pairs of words represent different aspects of a dichotomy which is central to Christianity from the start and was for a long time unknown to Islam. These words simply didn't exist in Arabic except to the extent that they were needed and created by Arabic-speaking Christians. Now that has become part of the common accepted vocabulary of Islam. We are seeing